Welcome to a journey along the most famous trade routes in human history, the Silk Road. For over 1,000 years, these interconnected paths stretched from the bustling markets of China to the Mediterranean shores of the Roman Empire, carrying not just silk, but spices and stories, not just goods, but ideas, religions, technologies, and diseases that would shape the course of civilizations. If you enjoy these immersive historical journeys, please like and subscribe. It helps us continue creating content for you. Now, let us begin our voyage across mountains, deserts, and civilizations. This is not a single road, but rather a vast network of routes, shifting over time, adapting to political changes, following water sources and mountain passes, connecting oases and cities across some of the most forbidding terrain on Earth. To travel the entire length of the Silk Road, from Chang'an in China to Rome or Constantinople, would take years, crossing deserts where temperatures soared above 100 degrees and froze below zero, climbing mountain passes where the air was too thin to breathe comfortably, traversing grasslands ruled by nomadic peoples who could be traders one day and raiders the next. Few merchants ever traveled the entire route. Instead, goods passed from hand to hand, carried by Chinese traders to Central Asian middlemen, by Persian merchants to Syrian dealers, by caravan masters who knew particular sections intimately, but never saw the journey's end. A bolt of silk might take 2 years to travel from the looms of China to the markets of Rome, changing hands a dozen times, increasing in value at each exchange, until its final price was hundreds of times what the weaver had been paid. Let us begin where the silk began, in China, in the great capital of Chang'an, during the Tang Dynasty, the golden age of the Silk Road. The year is 750 CE, and Chang'an is the largest city in the world, home to more than 1 million people. Its walls stretch for miles, encompassing not just Chinese residents, but also Persians and Arabs, Indians and Turks, Koreans and Japanese. The city's West Market is a babel of languages, a riot of colors and smells, where merchants from across Asia gather to trade. In a warehouse near the West Market, a merchant named Li Wei examines bolts of silk. He is 40 years old, the third generation of his family in the silk trade, and he knows quality when he sees it. This particular bolt is exceptional. The weave is tight and even, the color a deep crimson, achieved through multiple dyeings with expensive cochineal, and when he holds it up to the light streaming through the warehouse window, it seems to glow. Silk production is China's most closely guarded secret. For centuries, the Chinese have maintained a monopoly on this miraculous fabric. And the penalty for revealing the secrets of sericulture, the cultivation of silkworms, is death. Li Wei does not know how silk is made, nor does he particularly care. His expertise lies in evaluating finished cloth and in the complex web of relationships required to move goods westward along the trade routes. Li Wei represents a particular type of merchant, one who operates within China, purchasing silk from producers and selling it to the foreign merchants and Sogdian traders who will carry it westward. He does not travel the Silk Road himself. Such journeys are long, dangerous, and expensive. Instead, he profits from his knowledge of quality, his connections with silk producers, and his ability to negotiate in multiple languages. The silk he examines today has been ordered by a Sogdian merchant named Nanaivandak. The Sogdians are the true masters of the Silk Road, an Iranian people from the cities of Samarkand and Bukhara who have made themselves indispensable as middlemen. They speak multiple languages, Sogdian, Chinese, Turkish, Persian, and maintain trading colonies in cities across Central Asia. Their letters, discovered 1,000 years later in an abandoned watchtower, reveal a network of family businesses spanning thousands of miles, with fathers in Samarkand directing sons in Dunhuang and nephews in Chang'an. Nanaivandak arrives at the warehouse as the afternoon sun slants through the high windows. He is a man of perhaps 50, dressed in a long coat of Central Asian style, his face weathered from years of travel. He and Li Wei exchange greetings in Chinese, and then they turn to business. The quality? Nanaivandak asks. Excellent, Li Wei replies. Woven in Zhejiang province, dyed here in Chang'an. The crimson is particularly fine. Nanaivandak examines the silk with the practiced eye of one who has handled such goods for decades. He stretches it, holds it to the light, checks the flaws in the weave. Finding none, he nods. The price? The negotiation that follows is ritualized, almost choreographed. Li Wei names a price, Nanivandak expresses shock at such an outrageous figure. Li Wei explains the quality, the labor involved, the rarity of such fine dye. Nanivandak counters with an offer half the original price. Li Wei looks pained, speaks of his own costs, his family's needs. Back and forth they go until eventually they reach a figure that both have known from the beginning they would accept. But this is not merely theater. The negotiation establishes respect, maintains the relationship, and ensures that both parties feel they have achieved a fair outcome. Business on the Silk Road is built on relationships that span decades, sometimes generations. A reputation for honest dealing is worth more than the profit from any single transaction. The silk will leave Chang'an in a caravan of 50 camels, traveling northwest through the Gansu Corridor, a narrow strip of territory between the Tibetan Plateau to the south and the Gobi Desert to the north. This corridor has been the gateway from China to Central Asia for millennia, and it is studded with garrison towns, watchtowers, and beacon stations, remnants of the Han Dynasty's expansion westward 2 centuries before the Common Era. The first major stop is Dunhuang, nearly a month's travel from Chang'an. Dunhuang sits at the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, one of the most forbidding expanses on Earth. The city is a junction point where the Silk Road splits into northern and southern routes, both skirting the desert but never crossing its waterless heart. Here, merchants must decide their path, must prepare for the desert crossing ahead, must say prayers at the Buddhist caves carved into the nearby cliffs. Let us pause here, in Dunhuang, and consider what traveling the Silk Road truly meant. The romantic image of caravans crossing exotic lands obscures the reality. This was among the most difficult journeys any human could undertake. The distances were vast. From Chang'an to Samarkand alone was over 2,000 miles. The terrain was hostile, mountains where passes closed with snow for months each year, deserts where water sources were separated by days of travel, grasslands where nomadic peoples demanded tribute or took goods by force. Merchants did not travel alone, but in caravans for mutual protection and support. A typical caravan might include dozens of merchants, hundreds of animals, armed guards, guides who knew the route, translators who spoke local languages, and servants who handled the daily work of managing animals and setting up camp. The caravan was a mobile community, a temporary society with its own hierarchies, rules, and rhythms. The animals were crucial. Horses were too valuable and required too much fodder for routine transport. Instead, the Silk Road relied on camels, specifically the Bactrian camel with its 2 humps, capable of carrying heavy loads, surviving on minimal water, and enduring both the burning heat of summer and the bitter cold of winter. A single camel could carry up to 400 pounds of goods, could go for days without water, and could eat the sparse vegetation of desert and steppe. But camels were not just pack animals, they were investments, requiring care and expertise to maintain. A merchant's wealth was measured partly in camels. Losing animals to disease, accident, or theft could bankrupt a trading enterprise. The camel drivers, men who spent their entire lives managing these animals, were essential members of any caravan, their knowledge of animal behavior and health as valuable as any merchant's knowledge of goods and prices. Let us follow Nanaivandak's caravan as it leaves Dunhuang, taking the northern route around the Taklamakan Desert. This route passes through a string of oasis cities, Hami, Turpan, Kucha, Aksu, each dependent on snowmelt from the Tian Shan Mountains to the north. These cities are green jewels set in brown desert, places where fruit trees grow and irrigation channels bring water to fields of wheat and barley. The journey between oases is the dangerous part. The caravan travels in the early morning and late afternoon, avoiding the midday heat. The desert is not sand dunes as popular imagination suggests, but rather gravel and rock, stretching to the horizon in every direction. The air is so dry that lips crack and bleed, that leather goods shrink and split, that even the camels move with heads lowered against the desiccating wind. At night, the temperature plummets. The desert that baked under the sun becomes bitterly cold. The caravan makes camp, setting up felt tents, building small fires from the dried brush they have carried with them. The merchants sit together, drinking tea, sharing stories, conducting the social business that maintains relationships and builds trust. Some pray. Buddhists, Zoroastrians, Nestorian Christians, and eventually Muslims all traveled these routes, and the Silk Road was as much a conduit for religions as for goods. In Turpan, the caravan rests for several days. This oasis city sits in a depression below sea level. one of the lowest points on Earth. And the heat here in summer is legendary, but it is winter now, merely warm rather than scorching, and the city is bustling with activity. Turpan's grapes are famous throughout Central Asia, and its wines are prized even in the sophisticated markets of Chang'an. Here, Nanai Vandak's caravan meets another traveling eastward, carrying goods from Persia and beyond. The eastbound caravan brings glassware from Syria, precious stones from India, medicines and aromatics from Arabia. Among its merchants is a Persian named Bahram, traveling to Chang'an for the first time, eager to establish himself in the lucrative China trade. The two caravans camp together for several nights, and the merchants exchange information more valuable than any commodity. Nanai Vandak tells Bahram about conditions in China, about which officials can be bribed and which must be approached with proper protocol, about the preferences of Chinese buyers and the current prices of Persian goods. Bahram tells Nanai Vandak about political changes in Persia, about new sources of supply, about routes that have become dangerous due to war or banditry. This exchange of information is how the Silk Road functioned. There were no guidebooks, no reliable maps, no formal institutions to facilitate trade. Instead, there was a network of relationships, of personal connections, of informal knowledge passed merchant to merchant. To succeed on the Silk Road required not just capital, but also social capital. The ability to make connections, to call in favors, to be part of the community of traders who helped each other because they knew they would need help in return. From Turpan, the northern route continues westward to Kucha, a major Buddhist center, famous for its monasteries and its music. Here, the influence of Indian culture is strong, brought by Buddhist monks traveling from India through the passes of the Hindu Kush and Pamir mountains. The monasteries are decorated with frescoes showing the Buddha and Bodhisattvas, and the local musicians are so skilled that some are invited to perform at the Chinese imperial court. The mixing of cultures along the Silk Road was constant and profound. Chinese merchants adopted Central Asian styles of dress better suited to desert travel. Persian merchants learned Chinese language and customs. Indian Buddhism spread eastward to China and Japan, westward to Central Asia, adapted at each stage to local beliefs and practices. Artistic styles blended. Chinese motifs appeared in Persian metalwork, Greek sculptural techniques influenced Buddhist art, nomadic animal styles decorated Chinese silks. This cultural exchange was not always peaceful or voluntary. Armies marched along the Silk Road, conquering cities, establishing empires, imposing their culture and religion. But even conquest created connections, opened routes, facilitated exchanges. The very term Silk Road obscures this multiplicity. There were many Silk Roads, many routes, constant adaptation to changing political and environmental conditions. Beyond Kucha lies Kashgar, where the northern and southern routes around the Taklamakan Desert reunite. Kashgar sits at a crucial junction, where routes from China meet routes from India, where paths north to the Eurasian steppe intersect with trails south to Tibet. The city is cosmopolitan in a way that even Chang'an cannot match. For every people engaged in Asian trade passes through Kashgar at some point. Here, goods are redistributed, repackaged, combined into new loads. The silk that left Chang'an is joined by tea, porcelain, lacquerware, all the luxury goods that the world desires from China. In return, the westbound caravans will carry back jade from Khotan, horses from the Fergana Valley, gemstones from the mines of Badakhshan, and above all, the goods from further west, glassware, textiles, and metalwork that will command extraordinary prices in Chinese markets. Nana Vandak has been to Kashgar many times, and he has connections here, fellow Sogdians who run caravanserais, who provide warehouses for storage, who know which local officials need to be paid and which can be safely ignored. The city is technically controlled by the Tang Chinese Empire, but in practice, local powers hold sway, and the smart merchant navigates between competing authorities, paying taxes and fees to each, while trying not to take sides in local disputes. This is the art of Silk Road trade, not just moving goods, but navigating politics, understanding relationships, reading the complex social landscape of oasis cities and nomadic territories. A merchant needs to know when to be generous with gifts, when to be firm in negotiations, when to appeal to higher authorities, and when to work around them. The most successful merchants like Nana Vandak are as much diplomats as businessmen, building networks of relationships that smooth their path across thousands of miles. As we pause here in Kashgar, At the junction of routes, at the meeting point of cultures, we can reflect on what the Silk Road truly was. It was not merely a route for trade, but a conduit for exchange of every kind. Ideas traveled these routes: Buddhism from India to China, Nestorian Christianity from Persia to Central Asia, eventually Islam from Arabia to everywhere. Technologies spread: papermaking from China to the Islamic world, and eventually to Europe. Glass-making techniques from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Metallurgical knowledge in every direction. Diseases also traveled these routes. The Justinianic plague that devastated the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century likely came from Central Asia via Silk Road connections. The Black Death that would kill a third of Europe's population in the 14th century followed Silk Road routes from Central Asia to the Black Sea and then to Mediterranean ports. The Silk Road connected the world for better and worse, long before the age of global exploration. As Nana Vandak's caravan prepares to leave Kashgar, heading west across the Pamir Mountains towards Samarkand, we will follow the silk on the next stage of its journey, from the oasis cities of the Tarim Basin to the great urban centers of Sogdiana and beyond. The Pamir Mountains are called the roof of the world, and with good reason. These peaks tower over 15,000 feet, their passes among the highest regularly traveled routes on Earth. The air is thin here, so thin that breathing requires effort, that even experienced travelers suffer headaches and nausea, that animals struggle with loads that would be manageable at lower elevations. Nanai Vandak's caravan begins the ascent from Kashgar in early spring, timing their journey to cross the passes after the worst winter snows have melted, but before the summer heat makes water scarce in the valleys below. Even so, the crossing will take weeks, and the dangers are manifold. Avalanches can bury entire caravans. Crevasses hidden by snow can swallow men and animals. The extreme cold can freeze exposed flesh in minutes, and at these altitudes, even small injuries can prove fatal if infection sets in. The caravan moves slowly, the camels picking their way along narrow trails that wind between sheer cliffs and deep gorges. They follow routes established over millennia, marked by stone cairns built by countless previous travelers. These cairns serve as waymarkers, guiding caravans through landscapes where everything looks the same, where a wrong turn could mean wandering until supplies run out. The local people, the mountain Tajiks and Kyrgyz, know these routes intimately. Some serve as guides, leading caravans through for payment in goods or coin. Others demand tolls for passage through their territory. Still others raid caravans when they see opportunity, though attacking a well-armed caravan is risky business. The relationship between merchants and mountain peoples is complex, sometimes cooperative, sometimes adversarial, always wary. At night, the caravan camps in stone shelters built at regular intervals along the route. These shelters are crude, just walls providing windbreak, but they are precious. Baghdad, in the year 750 CE, is at the beginning of its golden age. The city gleams with new construction, mosques with soaring minarets, palaces surrounded by gardens, markets roofed with vaulted ceilings to provide shade from the brutal summer sun. The Abbasid caliphs have made this city their capital, and they pour wealth into making it magnificent, a statement of their power and sophistication. In one of Baghdad's many caravanserais, a merchant named Ibrahim al-Shirazi examines the silk that Shahpur has brought from Samarkand. Ibrahim is a specialist in luxury goods, trading primarily in silk, fine textiles, and precious stones. His customers are the wealthy, court officials, successful merchants, land-owning families who need to display their status through material possessions. Ibrahim is Arab by ethnicity, but Persian by culture, speaking both languages fluently, along with Turkish and some Greek. He was born in Shiraz, trained in the family business by his father and uncles, and now operates from Baghdad, though his network extends throughout the Caliphate and beyond. He represents a new type of merchant, one who operates within the vast Islamic world that stretches from Spain to Central Asia, a world unified by religion and increasingly by language, law, and commercial practices. The silk Shahpur offers is of exceptional quality, and Ibrahim recognizes its value immediately. But he negotiates carefully, as much to maintain his reputation as a shrewd trader as to secure a good price. The negotiation is conducted in Persian over tea served in delicate glass cups, glass being another luxury trade good, in this case produced in Syria and carried eastward. They discuss not just price, but also the broader context of trade. Shapur shares news from Samarkand, political tensions between local rulers, the arrival of Chinese embassies, changes in taxation that affect merchant caravans. Ibrahim reciprocates with intelligence from Baghdad and beyond, the callous policies toward merchants, conflicts in Syria that might disrupt routes to the Mediterranean, new opportunities in expanding markets. This exchange of information is as valuable as the silk itself. Knowledge is power in long-distance trade, and merchants who understand the broader picture can anticipate changes, adjust their strategies, and profit from others' ignorance.
The successful merchant is not just a buyer and seller of goods, but a gatherer and analyst of intelligence, someone who can read the political and economic currents and navigate accordingly. Ibrahim purchases the silk and arranges for its transport to Damascus, where he maintains a warehouse and trading office managed by a cousin. Damascus is the ancient city on the edge of the Syrian desert, a crossroads that has seen empires rise and fall for millennia. It is famous for its steel. Damascus blades are prized throughout the world, and for its textiles, though the silk that passes through is mostly from China, not locally produced. The route from Baghdad to Damascus follows ancient paths through Mesopotamia and across the Syrian desert. This is dangerous territory, where Bedouin tribes roam, sometimes trading peacefully, sometimes raiding caravans. Successful passage requires either strong military escort or, more commonly, payment of tribute to the tribal leaders who control access to water sources and safe passage through their territory. The caravans that ply this route are different from those crossing Central Asia. Here, the primary pack animal is not the camel, but the dromedary, the single-humped Arabian camel, better suited to the hot deserts of the Middle East. These animals are faster than Bactrian camels, capable of carrying slightly less weight, but covering distance more quickly. In the Syrian desert, speed can mean survival. Damascus, when the caravan arrives after 2 weeks of travel, is a green oasis watered by the Barada River, which flows from the mountains to the west. The city has been continuously inhabited for thousands of years, and its souks, covered markets, are legendary throughout the Islamic world. Here merchants from across the caliphate gather to trade, and the diversity of goods is staggering. In Damascus, the silk from China meets other luxury goods flowing along different trade routes. From India come spices, pepper, cinnamon, cardamom that are worth more than their weight in silver. From East Africa come ivory, gold dust, and exotic animals. From the Byzantine Empire come manufactured goods, fine glass, metalwork, and textiles that, while not silk, are sophisticated products of a still-functioning imperial economy. Ibrahim's cousin, Yusuf, manages the Damascus warehouse and has already arranged buyers for the silk. Some will go to local wealthy families. Some will be purchased by merchants trading with Constantinople, the Byzantine capital. And some will go to Egypt, where Cairo's markets serve as a hub for trade flowing south into Africa and west across the Mediterranean to Sicily, Italy, and beyond. Let us follow one batch of silk as it continues westward to Constantinople, carried by a Greek merchant named Stephanos. Stephanos is a middleman operating between the Islamic and Byzantine worlds, a delicate position requiring careful navigation of religious and political tensions. The Byzantine Empire and the Caliphate are often at war, but trade continues even during conflicts, flowing through neutral intermediaries or through brief truces arranged specifically for commercial purposes. Stephanos purchases not just silk, but also spices, which he will sell in Constantinople at substantial markup. The Byzantine capital is the largest and wealthiest city in Christendom, home to perhaps 500,000 people, and its markets consume luxury goods in vast quantities. The imperial court sets fashions that the wealthy throughout the empire strive to emulate, and silk is a marker of status, regulated by law. Certain colors and patterns can be worn only by those of particular rank. The journey from Damascus to Constantinople can be made by land or sea. Stephanos chooses the sea route, booking passage on a merchant ship sailing from the port of Tripoli. The ship is a broad-beamed sailing vessel, capable of carrying significant cargo, but vulnerable to storms and pirates. Mediterranean shipping has been conducted for millennia, but it remains dangerous. Ships are lost regularly to weather or raiders, and marine insurance, while it exists in rudimentary form, cannot fully protect against loss. The voyage takes 2 weeks, hugging the coast of Syria and Asia Minor, stopping at ports along the way to take on supplies and additional cargo. At each port, The ship picks up local products, olive oil from one town, wine from another, dried fish from a third. The Mediterranean is a vast trading network unto itself, connected to, but distinct from, the overland Silk Road routes. Here, sailors and ships replace caravans and camels, but the logic of trade remains the same. Buy low, sell high, manage risk, maintain relationships. Stefanos stands at the ship's railing, watching the coast slide by. He has made this journey dozens of times, yet it never becomes routine. Each voyage brings its own hazards and opportunities. He thinks about the cargo in the hold, silk worth a small fortune, spices worth almost as much, other goods of lesser value, but necessary to fill out the load. If the ship reaches Constantinople safely, he will profit handsomely. If it does not, well, that is the nature of trade. Risk and reward are inseparable. The ship rounds Cape Helles and enters the Dardanelles, the narrow strait that connects the Mediterranean to the Sea of Marmara and ultimately to the Black Sea. This strait is one of the most strategic waterways in the world, controlled by Constantinople, giving the Byzantine Empire leverage over trade between south and north, between Europe and Asia. Every ship passing through pays customs duties, a significant source of imperial revenue. Constantinople itself, when it finally comes into view, is magnificent. The city rises on 7 hills, surrounded on 3 sides by water, its walls massive and forbidding. The Hagia Sophia, the great church built by Justinian 2 centuries earlier, dominates the skyline, its massive dome seeming to float above the city. This is the new Rome, the continuation of the Roman Empire in the east, though it is increasingly Greek in language and culture, Christian in identity, distinct from both the Latin West and the Islamic South and East. The ship docks at the harbor, and Stefanos oversees the unloading of his cargo. Customs officials inspect the goods, assess their value, and collect duties, 10% of the cargo's estimated worth, paid in gold solidi, the Byzantine currency that is still the standard throughout the Mediterranean. This is a significant expense, but the prices Stefanos can command in Constantinople's markets will more than compensate. The silk is transported to a warehouse near the Hippodrome, the great arena where chariot races and other public spectacles are held. Stefanos has rented space here for years, and the warehouse keeper knows him well. Over the next several days, Stefanos will receive visits from potential buyers, agents of wealthy families, merchants who supply the imperial court, dealers who will distribute the silk to provincial markets. Among his customers is a court official named Leo, who is purchasing silk on behalf of the empress. The imperial family consumes vast quantities of luxury goods, both for their own use and for gifts to foreign dignitaries and favored subjects. A gift of silk from the emperor is a mark of particular honor, and the quality of the gift reflects the importance of the recipient. Leo examines the silk critically, though both he and Stefanos know he will purchase it. The quality is excellent, the price reasonable, and the empress has sent him specifically to secure silk of this type. But the ritual of examination must be observed, the haggling conducted, the proper forms followed. Byzantine bureaucracy is legendary in its complexity, and even something as simple as purchasing silk involves paperwork, signatures, and official seals. The transaction completed, Stefanos can reflect on the journey of the silk he has just sold. It was woven in China, perhaps 8 months ago, by weavers whose names he will never know. It traveled by caravan across deserts and mountains, changed hands in oasis cities and caravanserais, crossed cultural and linguistic boundaries, was examined and evaluated by dozens of merchants, and finally reached Constantinople, where it will adorn the empress of the Byzantine Empire. And this is just one bolt of silk, one thread in the vast tapestry of Silk Road trade. At this very moment, thousands of other merchants are conducting similar transactions across Eurasia. Caravans are crossing the Gobi Desert, ships are sailing the Indian Ocean, pack trains are climbing mountain passes, goods flow east and west, north and south, in a constant circulation that connects civilizations and creates prosperity. But the Silk Road carries more than just goods. Traveling with the merchants are ideas, technologies, and religions. Buddhism spread from India to China along these routes. Nestorian Christianity reached China via Central Asian missions. Islam expanded eastward through merchant communities and Sufi missionaries. Papermaking technology, gunpowder, the compass, all traveled the Silk Road, changing civilizations they reached. Diseases also traveled these routes. The great plagues of history, the Antonine Plague of the 2nd century, the Justinianic Plague of the 6th century, and later the Black Death of the 14th century, all spread along Silk Road routes. The interconnection that made trade possible also made pandemic disease possible. The Silk Road was a vector for everything, good and bad, beneficial and harmful, transformative in ways both positive and negative. In Constantinople, Stephanos reinvests his profits from the silk sale. He purchases Byzantine-manufactured goods, fine glassware, metalwork, religious icons that he will carry back to Damascus and sell to Islamic buyers. He also books passage on a ship departing for Venice, carrying letters of credit and commercial documents. The medieval economy is developing increasingly sophisticated financial instruments, letters of credit, bills of exchange, partnerships and commenda contracts that facilitate trade across long distances without requiring the physical transport of large amounts of coinage. These financial innovations are as important as the physical infrastructure of roads and caravanserais. They allow merchants to move value without moving coins, to conduct business in multiple cities simultaneously, to pool resources for expensive ventures while sharing risk. The Silk Road economy is not primitive barter, but rather a complex system of credit, trust, and sophisticated accounting. Venice, the ship's destination, is a rising power in Mediterranean trade. Built on islands in a lagoon, protected from land invasion, the city has grown wealthy by serving as an intermediary between Byzantine, Islamic, and Western European markets. Venetian merchants are famous, or infamous, for their sharp dealing, their willingness to trade with anyone, regardless of religion, their focus on profit above all other considerations. From Venice, goods from the east, silk, spices, precious stones flow northward across the Alps into the heart of Europe. The Silk Road does not end at the Mediterranean. It extends into Europe, connecting to networks of trade routes that reach to England, Scandinavia, and Russia. Chinese silk might ultimately adorn a bishop in Paris, a king in London, or a prince in Kiev. But by the time silk reaches Western Europe, it has passed through so many hands, been marked up so many times, that it costs truly extraordinary amounts. A single bolt of silk might cost more than a farmer could earn in a lifetime, more than the annual revenue of a small estate. Only the very wealthy can afford it, and sumptuary laws regulate who is permitted to wear it. Silk is not just cloth, it is a marker of social status, a symbol of connection to the wider world, a tangible link to distant exotic lands. As we pause here, in Venice, at the western terminus of the Silk Road's longest extension, we can reflect on what this network of trade routes has shown us. The world of the 8th century, indeed the world from the ancient period through the medieval era, was far more connected than we often imagine. Goods, ideas, people, and diseases circulated across Eurasia, creating a proto-global economy and culture. The Silk Road was not a single route, but a network, not a highway, but a web of connections, constantly shifting, adapting to political changes and geographical obstacles, maintained by thousands of merchants pursuing profit, but collectively creating something remarkable, a system that linked civilizations from the Pacific to the Atlantic, that facilitated not just economic exchange, but cultural transmission, that shaped the course of world history in profound ways. In the next segment of our journey, we will explore some of the other routes and commodities that made up this vast trading network. For the Silk Road was not just about silk, and it did not consist only of the overland routes across Central Asia. There were maritime routes through the Indian Ocean, northern routes across the steppes, southern routes through India and Arabia, and there were countless goods besides silk, spices and precious stones, horses and slaves, paper and porcelain, ideas and religions. The complete story of the Silk Road is the story of human civilization itself, of how people have always sought to connect, to trade, to learn from each other, to share goods and ideas across distances. It is a story that continues today, though the routes and methods have changed. The drive to connect, to exchange, to profit from interaction with others, this is as old as humanity itself, and the Silk Road represents one of its most spectacular expressions. While caravans crossed the deserts and mountains of Central Asia, ships sailed the waters of the Indian Ocean, carrying goods between China, India, Arabia, and East Africa. These maritime routes were as important as the overland Silk Road, and for some goods, particularly spices, which were valuable enough to justify the risks of sea travel, the sea routes were actually preferred. Let us shift our focus from the merchants of the overland routes to the sailors and traders of the maritime Silk Road. We begin in the port city of Guangzhou, on the southern coast of China, in the year 800 CE. Guangzhou, known to Arab traders as Khanfu, is one of the great cosmopolitan ports of the medieval world, rivaling Alexandria or Constantinople in the diversity of its population and the volume of its trade. The city is home not just to Chinese, but also to Arab, Persian, Indian, and Southeast Asian communities. Each group has its own quarter, its own markets, its own places of worship. There are mosques for Muslims, temples for Hindus, synagogues for Jews, churches for Nestorian Christians, and of course Buddhist and Taoist temples for the Chinese. The city's commercial regulations recognize this diversity, allowing foreign merchants to operate under their own laws in many matters, creating a kind of medieval multiculturalism driven by practical commercial considerations. In the harbor, dozens of ships are moored, Chinese junks with their distinctive battened sails, Arab dhows with their triangular lateen sails, Indian vessels, and Southeast Asian craft. These ships represent different nautical traditions, each adapted to particular sea conditions and trading patterns, but all participating in the same vast network of maritime commerce. Among the Arab merchants in Guangzhou is a man named Suleiman, originally from Siraf on the Persian Gulf. Suleiman has been trading in the Indian Ocean for 20 years, making the long voyage from Persia to China multiple times. His account of these journeys, written in Arabic, will survive into modern times, providing historians with invaluable details about medieval maritime trade. Suleiman is preparing for his return voyage to Persia, and he is loading his ship with Chinese goods. Silk, of course, but also porcelain, the fine ceramics that the Chinese produce and that command high prices in Middle Eastern markets. Also tea, which is beginning to gain popularity beyond China, and ginger and other items that the Middle Eastern markets desire. But Suleiman's most important cargo is not from China, but from the Spice Islands, the Moluccas in modern Indonesia, which he will pick up at ports along the way. Cloves, nutmeg, and mace grow nowhere else on earth, and they are worth their weight in silver, sometimes even their weight in gold. These spices are used for medicine, for preserving food, and increasingly, in the Islamic world and Europe, for demonstrating wealth and sophistication. The voyage from Guangzhou to the Persian Gulf typically takes about 6 months, depending on the monsoon winds. The monsoon system is the key to Indian Ocean sailing, predictable seasonal winds that blow from the southwest during summer and from the northeast during winter. Sailors have known and exploited these winds for millennia, timing their voyages to ride the monsoons, sailing southwest from China to India during the northern winter, then waiting in Indian ports for the winds to reverse before continuing to Arabia or East Africa. Suleiman's ship departs Guangzhou in November, catching the northeast monsoon that will carry them south and west. The ship is a dhow, built in the traditional Arab manner with planks sewn together with coconut fiber rather than nailed. This technique, which seems primitive to those unfamiliar with it, actually produces vessels that are flexible and resilient, better able to withstand the stresses of ocean sailing than rigidly constructed ships. The crew is multinational: Arabs, Persians, Indians, and a few Chinese and Malays. Each brings particular skills, and the cooperation of these diverse sailors makes possible the voyages that connect distant civilizations. There are no maps in the modern sense, no charts with precise coordinates. Instead, the pilots navigate by observing the stars, the color and movement of the water, the flight patterns of birds, and by memorizing routes passed down through generations of sailors. The first stop is Champa, in what is now central Vietnam. This kingdom controls important ports along the coast and produces valuable goods: aromatic woods, ivory from elephants that roam the interior forests, and rhinoceros horn, prized in Chinese medicine. The ship takes on cargo here, goods that Suleiman will sell in ports further west. From Champa, they sail through the straits between the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra, a narrow waterway that funnels trade between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. These straits are controlled by the Srivijaya Empire, based in Sumatra, which has grown wealthy by taxing passing ships and by trading in the products of Southeast Asia: spices, aromatic woods, and tin from mines in the Malay Peninsula. In the port of Palembang, the Srivijaya capital, Suleiman meets with local merchants to purchase the spices that are the true prize of his voyage. The cloves, nutmeg, and mace have already traveled from the Spice Islands, carried by local traders through the Indonesian archipelago. Suleiman will transport them westward, selling them in markets where they will command prices many times what he pays here. The negotiation for spices is complex, involving not just price, but also questions of quality, purity, and authenticity. Spices are sometimes adulterated with cheaper substances, and merchants must know how to test for quality. Suleiman examines the cloves carefully, smelling them, tasting them, checking their color and form. These skills learned over years of trading are what separates successful merchants from failed ones. With his cargo complete, Suleiman's ship continues westward, crossing the Bay of Bengal toward India. This is the most dangerous part of the voyage, where the ship is far from land for days at a time, where storms can rise suddenly, where pirates lurk near the coasts of India and Sri Lanka. The crew maintains watches day and night, ready to adjust sails, bail water, or defend against attack. The Indian coast comes into view after 2 weeks of open ocean sailing. The ship makes for Quilon, a major port on the Malabar coast, famous for its pepper. Black pepper from India is perhaps the single most important spice in medieval trade, valued everywhere from China to Europe, used not just for flavoring, but also for preserving meat and for medicine. In Quilon, Suleiman sells some of his Chinese goods and purchases pepper, which he will add to his cargo of Indonesian spices. He also gathers information from other merchants about conditions further west, about piracy in the Arabian Sea, about political situations in various ports, about prices in different markets. This intelligence gathering is as much a part of his business as buying and selling goods. The Indian Ocean maritime world is vast and diverse, encompassing many different political entities, languages, and cultures. But it is also unified by trade, by the shared experience of seafaring, by commercial practices that have evolved to facilitate exchange across these differences. Merchants from different backgrounds speak lingua franca languages, primarily Arabic and Persian in the medieval period, and use common systems of weights, measures, and commercial law. From Quilon, the ship sails north along the Indian coast, stopping at various ports to take on and discharge cargo. At each port, there are communities of Arab and Persian merchants, some permanent residents who have married local women and built businesses, others like Suleiman who come and go with the monsoons. These communities maintain caravanserais, warehouses, and mosques, creating familiar spaces in foreign lands. The final leg of the voyage takes them across the Arabian Sea to the Persian Gulf. This stretch is shorter than the earlier passages, but can be treacherous with strong currents and sudden storms. As the coast of Arabia appears on the western horizon, the crew gives thanks to Allah, to the sea itself, to their own skill and endurance that have brought them safely across thousands of miles of ocean. The ship enters the Persian Gulf and sails to Siraf, Suleiman's home port. Siraf is one of the great medieval ports, rivaling any city in size and wealth. It is built on a narrow coastal strip beneath barren mountains, seemingly an unpromising location, but its harbor and its position at the entrance to the Persian Gulf make it ideal for trade. Ships from India, China, and East Africa call here, and goods are transshipped to caravans that carry them inland to Baghdad, Damascus, and beyond. Suleiman's return after 6 months at sea is celebrated by his family and welcomed by the business community. He has brought back valuable cargo, has gathered intelligence about distant markets, and has maintained relationships with trading partners in the ports along his route. His wealth has increased, but more importantly, his reputation has been enhanced. He is known as a reliable trader, one who delivers quality goods, who honors his agreements, who understands the complex protocols of maritime commerce. The goods Suleiman brought from China and Southeast Asia will now disperse across the Islamic world. The porcelain will end up in wealthy households from Persia to Spain. The spices will be sold in markets throughout the Middle East and eventually will reach Europe via Mediterranean shipping. The silk will adorn the wealthy and powerful from Baghdad to Cairo to Cordoba. The maritime Silk Road operated on a different rhythm than the overland routes. Sea voyages were governed by the monsoons, creating a seasonal pattern of movement. Ships sailed east during one season, west during another, with months-long pauses waiting for winds to shift. This created an annual cycle that structured the lives of sailors and merchants, that determined when goods arrived in markets, that influenced prices and availability. The maritime routes also carried different goods than the overland routes, or the same goods in different proportions. Bulk goods like spices, which were too heavy to transport economically overland, were ideal for sea transport. Conversely, Some goods like horses, which could be walked overland, were difficult to transport by ship. The two systems, overland and maritime, were complementary, parts of a larger whole, and they were interconnected. Goods arriving by ship in Persian Gulf ports were often carried overland to Mediterranean ports, and vice versa. Information from maritime merchants influenced decisions by overland traders. Credit networks spanned both systems, allowing merchants to operate in multiple spheres simultaneously. The distinction between Silk Road and maritime trade is somewhat artificial. They were aspects of a single integrated system of Eurasian trade. The maritime routes also facilitated the spread of Islam in ways the overland routes did not. Muslim merchants sailing to Southeast Asia and China established communities in port cities, built mosques, married local women, and raised children who were Muslim. Over centuries, this presence transformed Southeast Asia, converting kingdoms and sultanates from Buddhism and Hinduism to Islam. The Maritime Silk Road was not just an economic network, but also a conduit for religious and cultural change. As we contemplate the maritime dimension of the Silk Road, we are reminded that the pre-modern world was far more mobile and connected than stereotypes of isolated traditional societies suggest. People traveled enormous distances, crossing deserts and oceans, encountering radically different cultures and creating networks of exchange that spanned the known world. The Silk Road, in its overland and maritime dimensions, was a manifestation of a fundamental human drive to connect, to trade, to learn from others. The risks were great. Merchants could lose their lives to bandits, storms, disease, or simply the accumulated hardships of travel. Investments could be wiped out by a single disaster. But the potential rewards were also great, not just material wealth, but also adventure, status, the satisfaction of succeeding in a challenging enterprise, and participation in something larger than oneself. The Silk Road merchants were not romantic adventurers, but practical businessmen, yet their collective enterprise created something remarkable, a network that transmitted goods, ideas, technologies, and religions across Eurasia, that connected civilizations and facilitated cultural exchange, that shaped the course of world history in profound and lasting ways. As our journey continues, we will explore how the Silk Road affected the societies it connected, how it shaped politics and culture, and how it eventually declined and was transformed as new technologies and new political arrangements created different patterns of global connection. The Silk Road was never just about commerce. Along with merchants traveling the routes came monks and missionaries, artists and artisans, soldiers and scholars, diplomats and adventurers. These travelers carried ideas that would transform the civilizations they reached, creating cultural exchanges as significant as any economic transaction. Let us follow one such traveler, a Buddhist monk named Xuanzang, who in 629 CE departed from Chang'an on a journey that would last 17 years and take him across Central Asia to India, the birthplace of Buddhism. Xuanzang's journey was not commercial but spiritual. He sought authentic Buddhist texts and teachings to bring back to China. Yet his travels illuminate the cultural dimension of the Silk Road as clearly as any merchant's journey reveals its economic aspects. Xuanzang was not supposed to leave China. The Tang Emperor had closed the borders, forbidding travel to the west. But Xuanzang was determined, believing that Buddhism in China had become corrupted and that only by reaching India could he access the true teachings of the Buddha. So he slipped out of Chang'an in secret, traveling by night, hiding by day, eventually reaching the northwestern frontiers where Chinese authority weakened. His route followed the familiar Silk Road paths, through the Gansu corridor to Dunhuang, then around the Taklamakan Desert, through cities we have already encountered, Hami, Turpan, Kucha, Kashgar. But Xuanzang's purposes were different from merchants. In each city, he stopped to visit Buddhist monasteries, to study with local teachers, to copy texts and learn local traditions of Buddhist practice. What Xuanzang discovered was that Buddhism had evolved differently in each region. In China, it had adapted to Chinese culture, incorporating elements of Taoism and Confucianism, developing distinctly Chinese schools of thought. In Central Asia, it mixed with local traditions, with remnants of Greek influence from Alexander's conquest centuries earlier, with Persian and Turkish elements. Buddhism was not a single unified religion, but rather a family of related traditions, each shaped by its cultural context. This diversity fascinated Xuanzang. He recorded everything he observed in detailed journals, descriptions of cities and monasteries, accounts of local customs and beliefs, measurements of Buddhist statues and stupas, translations of texts he encountered. His account, titled Great Tang Records on the Western Regions, would become one of the most important sources for historians studying the Silk Road in the 7th century. From Kashgar, Xuanzang crossed the Pamir Mountains, suffering the same hardships that merchant caravans endured: altitude sickness, freezing cold, dangerous passes. But he also experienced moments of transcendent beauty: crystalline air at high altitude, views of snow-covered peaks stretching to the horizon, the profound silence of the mountains. These experiences deepened his spiritual practice, making the journey itself a form of meditation. Descending from the Pamirs, Xuanzang entered the lands that are now Afghanistan, regions then under the control of various Turkish and Persian kingdoms. Here, Buddhism was still strong, though it would soon be challenged by the expansion of Islam. Xuanzang visited the great Buddhist center of Bamiyan, where colossal statues of the Buddha were carved into cliff faces, statues that would survive for nearly 14 centuries before being destroyed by the Taliban in 2001. From Afghanistan, Xuanzang descended into India, reaching the heartland of Buddhism, visiting sites associated with the Buddha's life: Bodh Gaya, where he achieved enlightenment; Sarnath, where he delivered his first sermon; Kushinagar, where he died. Xuanzang spent years in India, studying at the great Buddhist University of Nalanda, learning Sanskrit, mastering philosophical texts, engaging in debates with scholars from across the Buddhist world. Nalanda was one of the wonders of the medieval world, a university with thousands of students and hundreds of teachers, libraries containing hundreds of thousands of texts, endowed by kings and supported by revenue from hundreds of villages. Here, the highest levels of Buddhist scholarship were pursued, and scholars from China, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and across India gathered to study and debate. Xuanzang's time at Nalanda transformed his understanding of Buddhism. He mastered the complex philosophical traditions of Indian Buddhism, learned the languages necessary to read original texts, and established relationships with teachers and fellow students that would last his lifetime. When he finally returned to China in 645 CE, he brought with him hundreds of texts, many of which had never before been available in Chinese. His return to Chang'an was triumphant. The emperor who had initially opposed his departure now welcomed him as a hero. Xuanzang was given imperial support to establish a translation bureau, where teams of scholars worked to translate the Sanskrit texts he had brought back into Chinese. These translations would profoundly influence Chinese Buddhism, introducing new ideas and practices, sparking debates and creative synthesis with existing traditions. Xuanzang's journey is remarkable but not unique. Throughout the history of the Silk Road, similar cultural exchanges occurred. Nestorian Christian missionaries carried their faith from Persia to China, establishing communities that would persist for centuries. Manichaean missionaries spread their syncretic religion along the trade routes. Later, Sufi Muslims would use the Silk Road to carry Islam eastward, converting Central Asian kingdoms and eventually reaching China. Artists traveled the Silk Road, and their work shows the blending of styles. Buddhist art in Central Asia combines Indian, Persian, Greek, and Chinese elements. Islamic art incorporates Chinese motifs: dragons, phoenixes, cloud patterns. Chinese ceramics influenced Persian potters, who developed their own distinctive styles inspired by Chinese techniques. The Silk Road was a crucible of cultural creativity, where different traditions met, mingled, and produced new syntheses. Technologies also traveled these routes. The most famous example is papermaking, invented in China and carried westward along the Silk Road. Arab forces captured Chinese papermakers at the Battle of Talas in 751 CE, and the technology was soon established in Samarkand. From there, it spread throughout the Islamic world, reaching Europe in the 12th century. The availability of cheap paper revolutionized record-keeping, education, and eventually printing, fundamentally transforming societies that adopted it. Gunpowder, invented in China, traveled westward along similar routes, though the transmission took centuries and the technology evolved at each stage. The compass, first used in China for geomancy and navigation, reached the Islamic world and eventually Europe, making possible the age of exploration. Silk production techniques, though China tried to maintain its monopoly, eventually spread to Persia and Byzantium, fundamentally altering global silk trade patterns. The exchange was not one-directional. China received goods, ideas, and technologies from the West. Glass-making techniques came from the Roman world, grape cultivation and winemaking from Persia. Musical instruments, the pipa lute, the erhu fiddle, arrived from Central Asia and became integral to Chinese music. The chair, largely unknown in ancient China, where people sat on mats or platforms, was introduced from the West and gradually became standard Chinese furniture. Foods also traveled the Silk Road. Grapes, walnuts, cucumbers, sesame, and coriander all reached China from the West. Tea traveled from China to Central Asia and eventually to Europe. Spices flowed in multiple directions, as did agricultural techniques, irrigation methods, crop rotation systems, and new varieties of wheat and barley. The Silk Road's cultural influence extended to mathematics and science. Indian numerals, including the concept of zero, traveled westward through the Islamic world, where Arab mathematicians developed algebra and refined astronomy. These advances eventually reached Europe, providing the mathematical foundation for the scientific revolution. Chinese astronomical observations influenced Islamic and eventually European astronomy. Medical knowledge circulated: Chinese acupuncture and herbal medicine, Indian Ayurvedic practices, Greek humoral theory, each tradition learning from the others. Languages also evolved through Silk Road contact. Persian became a lingua franca of trade and diplomacy across Central Asia. Arabic spread with Islam, carrying with it a vast literature and scientific vocabulary. Turkish languages carried by nomadic peoples influenced sedentary societies. Sanskrit terms entered Central Asian and Chinese languages through Buddhism. Chinese loanwords appeared in Persian and Turkish. This linguistic exchange facilitated communication and created shared vocabularies that transcended ethnic and political boundaries. The Silk Road's golden age, roughly from the 7th to the 10th centuries, coincided with periods of relative political stability in the major civilizations it connected. The Tang dynasty in China, the Abbasid Caliphate in the Islamic world, and a patchwork of smaller but stable states in Central Asia created conditions favorable for trade and cultural exchange. When these political structures weakened, the Silk Road suffered, demonstrating how commerce required peace, or at least predictable relations between states. The Tang dynasty's cosmopolitanism was particularly remarkable. Chang'an in the 8th century was truly an international city, home to communities from across Asia and beyond. Foreign merchants were not merely tolerated, but actively encouraged. The city had Zoroastrian fire temples, Nestorian churches, Buddhist monasteries, and mosques, and fashion were fashionable among the Chinese elite. The emperor's guards included soldiers from Central Asia. Court entertainers came from Persia and India. This openness had limits, of course. Foreigners lived in designated quarters, were subject to special regulations, and could face discrimination or violence during times of tension. The famous persecution of Buddhism in 845 CE, while primarily targeting Chinese Buddhists, also affected foreign religious communities. And the Huangchao Rebellion of 875 to 884, which devastated Chang'an, included massacres of foreign merchants. Cosmopolitanism was real but fragile, dependent on political will and economic interest. In Central Asia, the Sogdian cities reached their peak during this period. Samarkand and Bukhara were not just commercial centers, but also cultural capitals, where Persian, Turkish, Chinese, and Indian influences met and merged. Sogdian became the lingua franca of the Silk Road, spoken by merchants from China to Byzantium. Sogdian art combined elements from multiple traditions: Buddhist iconography, Persian decorative motifs, Chinese landscape conventions, nomadic animal styles, creating a distinctive Central Asian aesthetic. The Islamic world's attitude toward knowledge from other cultures was generally positive during this period. The Abbasid caliphs sponsored the translation of Greek philosophical and scientific texts into Arabic, preserving works that might otherwise have been lost. They also patronized scholars from various traditions: Persian, Indian, Christian, Jewish, creating an intellectual environment that was remarkably cosmopolitan. Baghdad's House of Wisdom was similar in concept to Nalanda, a center where scholars from different backgrounds studied and debated. This openness to foreign knowledge contributed to the Islamic Golden Age, when Muslim scholars made fundamental advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, chemistry, and other fields. Many of these advances built on knowledge acquired through Silk Road exchanges: Chinese papermaking, Indian mathematics, Greek philosophy, Persian administrative techniques. The synthesis of these diverse traditions produced something new and extraordinary. The Silk Road also facilitated diplomatic exchanges. Embassies traveled between courts, carrying gifts and messages, negotiating treaties and alliances. These diplomatic missions often included scholars, artists, and craftsmen who shared knowledge along with goods. Chinese emperors sent embassies westward to establish alliances against nomadic peoples. Byzantine emperors sent missions eastward, seeking allies against Persia and later against the Arabs. The Abbasid caliphs exchanged embassies with the Tang court, establishing relationships that facilitated trade. These diplomatic contacts sometimes led to significant cultural exchanges. When the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid sent gifts to Charlemagne around 800 CE, included was an elephant, an extraordinary sight in medieval Europe. When Chinese embassies visited Central Asian and Persian courts, they brought not just silk but also examples of Chinese art and literature that influenced local cultures. When Persian and Arab embassies reached Chang'an, they brought not just commercial goods but also books, instruments, and ideas that enriched Chinese civilization. The artistic exchanges are particularly fascinating. Chinese ceramics influenced Islamic pottery, leading to the development of new techniques and styles. Islamic metalwork influenced Chinese metallurgy. Persian miniature painting influenced Chinese painting, and vice versa. Architectural techniques spread: the pointed arch, the dome, various decorative motifs, carried by craftsmen traveling the Silk Road, adapted to local traditions and materials. Musical exchange was equally significant. Instruments traveled the routes and were adopted and adapted by different cultures. The pipa lute, originally from Persia, became central to Chinese music. The oud, also from Persia, became the foundation of Arab music and eventually influenced European instruments like the lute. Rhythmic patterns, scales, and compositional techniques spread, creating musical connections that transcended linguistic and cultural boundaries. Food culture was transformed by Silk Road exchanges. Chinese cuisine incorporated ingredients from the West: grapes, walnuts, coriander, that became integral to certain dishes. Persian cuisine adopted Chinese cooking techniques and ingredients. Indian spices spread both east and west, transforming the cuisines they reached. Even today, the foodways of Silk Road regions show evidence of these ancient exchanges. The use of cumin in Xinjiang Chinese cooking, the dumplings found from China to Central Asia to Turkey, the bread-making traditions shared across Eurasia. The textile arts particularly benefited from Silk Road exchanges. Chinese silk production techniques eventually reached Persia and Byzantium, though this took centuries. Persian textile designs influenced Chinese silk patterns. Indian cotton textiles reached both China and the Mediterranean world, eventually transforming clothing in both regions. Central Asian felt-making techniques, born of nomadic necessity, spread to sedentary societies. The carpets of Persia and Central Asia show influences from multiple traditions: nomadic geometric patterns, Chinese floral motifs, Islamic calligraphic designs. Fashion itself traveled the Silk Road. Central Asian styles, long coats, trousers, boots, were adopted by Chinese elites for their practicality in horseback riding and cold weather. Chinese silk garments influenced Persian and Byzantine court dress. Turban styles spread from Persia to Central Asia to China. These adoptions were not mere imitation, but creative adaptation, as each culture modified foreign styles to fit local aesthetics and needs. The exchange of ideas about government and law is less visible but equally important. Chinese bureaucratic techniques influenced Central Asian states. Islamic legal concepts spread through Muslim merchants and missionaries. Persian administrative practices were adopted by both Chinese and Islamic courts. These institutional exchanges helped create more sophisticated and effective governments, though the borrowing was selective and adapted to local conditions. But we should not romanticize the Silk Road. It was also a conduit for conflict, disease, and suffering. Armies marched along these routes, conquering and destroying. Diseases spread, causing epidemics that killed millions. The slave trade, though less prominent than in other historical contexts, existed and caused immense human suffering. Bandits preyed on merchants, and not all traders were honest. Fraud and violence were part of the reality of long-distance trade. The environmental impact of the Silk Road was also significant. The demand for certain goods led to overexploitation of resources. Deforestation around cities reduced fuel supplies. Intensive agriculture in oases led to soil salinization and degradation. The introduction of new species sometimes disrupted local ecosystems. The Silk Road transformed not just human societies, but also the physical landscapes through which it passed. And the benefits of the Silk Road were unevenly distributed. Merchants and their associates grew wealthy, but the workers who produced the goods, the weavers, the farmers, the miners, often received minimal compensation. The porters and camel drivers who transported goods faced harsh conditions for modest pay. The slaves who labored in various capacities received nothing. The Silk Road enriched some while exploiting others, as economic systems generally do. Moreover, the cultural exchanges, while real and significant, should not obscure the persistence of conflict and misunderstanding between civilizations. Wars were fought, peoples were conquered, cultures were suppressed. The exchange of ideas did not prevent violence or create lasting peace. The Silk Road connected civilizations, but connection does not automatically produce harmony. Yet despite these qualifications, the Silk Road's contribution to human civilization was profound. It demonstrated that long-distance exchange was possible, even with pre-modern technology. It created prosperity that funded art, literature, science, and philosophy. It facilitated the spread of religions that shaped the spiritual lives of billions. It transmitted technologies that transformed societies. And it showed that different cultures could interact productively, could learn from each other, could create something new through synthesis. The Silk Road's golden age did not last forever. Political changes, particularly the Mongol conquests of the 13th century, would transform the routes and the nature of trade along them. Eventually, the development of maritime routes around Africa to India and the Americas would shift global trade patterns, reducing the importance of overland routes across Central Asia. The Silk Road declined, though it never completely disappeared. But during its centuries of flourishing, the Silk Road shaped world history in fundamental ways. The civilizations it connected influenced each other, creating the foundation for much of modern culture. The technologies it transmitted enabled advances that continue to shape our lives. The religious traditions it spread still claim billions of adherents. The artistic syntheses it facilitated produced works of enduring beauty. And the very idea of global connection, of exchange across vast distances, of learning from other cultures, these ideas, which seem natural to us today, were in part developed through the experiences of the Silk Road. As we approach the final segment of our journey, we will explore the decline of the Silk Road, the factors that led to its reduced importance, and its legacy in the modern world. For though the Silk Road is a living network of trade routes largely ended centuries ago, its influence persists, and the questions it raises about how cultures interact, how trade shapes societies, how distance can be overcome, remain relevant today. The Silk Road's decline was as gradual as its rise, unfolding over centuries rather than years, the result of multiple factors converging to reduce the importance of overland trade routes across Central Asia. No single event ended the Silk Road, but by the 16th century, it had clearly diminished from its medieval peak, replaced by other systems of global exchange. One factor was political fragmentation. The stability that had enabled the Silk Road's golden age depended on large, powerful states that could maintain order along the routes. When the Tang dynasty weakened in the 9th century, when the Abbasid Caliphate fragmented, when Central Asian kingdoms fell into conflict, trade became more difficult and dangerous. Merchants faced higher costs, greater risks, and more unpredictable conditions. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century initially revitalized the Silk Road. Under Mongol rule, a vast territory from China to Eastern Europe was united under a single political system, creating what historians call the Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace. During this period, trade flourished, with caravans able to travel across Asia with relative security, protected by Mongol authority. Marco Polo's journey from Venice to China, undertaken in the 1270s, was made possible by this Mongol peace. Polo's account of his travels, while embellished and sometimes inaccurate, captured European imagination and revealed a level of Asian sophistication that many Europeans had not previously recognized. His descriptions of Chinese cities, wealth, and technology amazed readers and stimulated European interest in Asian trade. But the Mongol Empire fragmented in the 14th century, breaking into successor states that often warred with each other. The unity that had enabled safe passage disappeared. Moreover, the Mongol conquests, while facilitating trade, also facilitated the spread of disease. The Black Death, which devastated Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia in the mid-14th century, traveled along Silk Road routes. Some historians estimate it killed a third to half of the populations in affected regions, disrupting trade networks and depopulating cities that had served as commercial centers. The rise of maritime trade was equally significant in the Silk Road's decline. As European navigators developed better ships and navigational techniques, as they discovered routes around Africa to India and across the Atlantic to the Americas, as maritime trade became cheaper and more reliable than overland caravan transport, the economic logic shifted. Why send goods overland across dangerous territory, paying tolls and taxes at every border, when ships could carry larger loads more cheaply and relatively safely? The Portuguese rounding the Cape of Good Hope in 1488 and reaching India by sea in 1498 marked a turning point. Now European merchants could buy spices and other Asian goods directly, without multiple Central Asian middlemen. The Venetian and Genoese merchants, who had dominated Mediterranean trade with the East, found their business undermined by Portuguese, and later Dutch and English, direct maritime trade with Asia. The discovery of the Americas by Europeans in 1492 also shifted global trade patterns. Enormous quantities of silver from American mines flowed to Europe and then to Asia, changing the economics of trade. New crops from the Americas, maize, potatoes, tomatoes, chili peppers, spread across Eurasia, transforming agricultural and culinary traditions. The center of global trade shifted from the Mediterranean and Central Asia toward the Atlantic and the new sea routes to Asia and the Americas. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 is sometimes cited as ending the Silk Road, but this is oversimplified. The Ottomans controlled routes between Europe and Asia, but they did not close them. They taxed them, as all states controlling trade routes did. The shift away from overland trade was driven more by the availability of maritime alternatives than by Ottoman policy. Religious and cultural factors also played a role. The solidification of religious boundaries between Christian Europe, the Islamic Middle East, and Buddhist/Confucian East Asia made cross-cultural exchange more difficult. While trade continued across these boundaries, the cosmopolitan mingling of earlier centuries diminished. Communities became more insular, more suspicious of foreign influences, less willing to adopt ideas and practices from other traditions. In Central Asia itself, the decline of urban centers reduced the infrastructure supporting trade. Cities that had thrived on Silk Road commerce shrank or were abandoned as trade routes shifted. Oases that had sustained caravans became isolated as traffic diminished. The knowledge and institutions that had facilitated trade, the caravanserais, the merchant networks, the multilingual brokers, gradually disappeared as they were no longer economically viable. Climate change also contributed. Central Asia experienced increasing aridity in later centuries, making some routes more difficult. Water sources dried up, oases shrank, and the already challenging environment of deserts and mountains became even more hostile. Agricultural productivity in some regions declined, reducing their ability to support trade. Yet we should be careful not to exaggerate the Silk Road's decline. Trade across Central Asia never completely ceased. Regional trade continued, connecting China with Central Asian states, Central Asia with Persia, Persia with Turkey. What declined was not all trade, but specifically the long-distance transit trade, the movement of goods from one end of Eurasia to the other via overland routes. And some Silk Road cities remained important regional centers. Samarkand, conquered by Timur, Tamerlane, in the 14th century, became the capital of his empire and was rebuilt on a grand scale. Bukhara remained a center of Islamic learning. Kashgar continued as a junction point for trade between China, Central Asia, and India. These cities adapted to changed circumstances, focusing on regional rather than transcontinental trade. In China, the Ming dynasty, which replaced the Mongol Yuan dynasty in 1368, initially withdrew from extensive foreign engagement. The early Ming sponsored voyages to Southeast Asia, India, and East Africa under the Admiral Zheng He, demonstrating Chinese capabilities in maritime trade. But later Ming emperors turned inward, restricting foreign trade and contact, partly from ideological conviction that China was self-sufficient and superior, and partly from practical concerns about controlling borders and maintaining social order. This Chinese withdrawal reduced demand for imports and reduced opportunities for foreign merchants in China. The great cosmopolitan cities of the Tang era, open to foreign influences, were replaced by a more culturally homogeneous and inward-looking society. While this generalization requires qualification, there was still significant trade, especially with Southeast Asia. The contrast with the Tang dynasty's openness is striking. The Silk Road's legacy, however, far outlasted its decline as a functioning trade network. The technologies, ideas, and cultural practices transmitted along these routes shaped civilizations permanently. Buddhism in China, Japan, and Korea, Islam in Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and parts of China, Nestorian Christianity in Central Asia, all spread via Silk Road routes and persisted long after those routes declined. Technologies like papermaking, printing, gunpowder, and the compass, transmitted along the Silk Road, fundamentally transformed societies. The agricultural products exchanged, new crops, new cultivation techniques, increased food production and population. The artistic and architectural traditions that blended along the Silk Road created distinctive styles that still influence design today. The Silk Road also provided a model for subsequent global trade networks. The techniques developed by Silk Road merchants, credit instruments, partnership contracts, information exchange, multilingual brokerage, informed later commercial practices. The cosmopolitan spirit of Silk Road cities, while imperfectly realized, offered a vision of cross-cultural exchange that remains relevant. In the modern era, the Silk Road has been rediscovered and romanticized. The term Silk Road itself was coined only in the 19th century by the German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen. It has since become shorthand for East-West cultural exchange, for the interconnection of civilizations, for the idea that trade and cultural contact can transcend political and cultural boundaries. Archaeologists and historians have worked to recover the physical and documentary evidence of the Silk Road. Explorers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Aurel Stein, Paul Pelliot, Sven Hayden, and others, discovered manuscripts, artifacts, and ruins in Central Asia, revealing the extent of the trade networks and cultural exchanges. These discoveries transformed understanding of Asian history and the connections between civilizations. The manuscripts found in caves near Dunhuang, for example, preserved texts in multiple languages: Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Sogdian, Uyghur, documenting the multilingual nature of Silk Road society. They included Buddhist texts, commercial documents, letters between merchants, and secular literature, providing unprecedented insight into daily life along the routes. Archaeological excavations of cities along the Silk Road revealed the material culture of these societies, the goods they produced and consumed, the architecture of their homes and public buildings, the art that decorated their spaces, the technologies they employed. These physical remains complement textual sources, showing how people actually lived rather than just how elite chroniclers described them. In recent decades, China has promoted the Belt and Road Initiative, explicitly invoking the Silk Road as a historical precedent for modern infrastructure development and economic integration across Eurasia. This initiative proposes to connect China with Europe, the Middle East, and Africa through rail lines, ports, and other infrastructure, creating a modern version of Silk Road connectivity. This modern revival of Silk Road imagery raises important questions. Can contemporary infrastructure projects recreate the cultural exchange that characterized the historical Silk Road? Does increased trade and connectivity automatically produce mutual understanding and peace, or can it also facilitate conflict and exploitation? What lessons from the historical Silk Road apply to modern globalization? The historical Silk Road shows that connection creates both opportunities and challenges. Trade brought prosperity, but also intensified conflicts over control of routes and resources. Cultural exchange enriched civilizations, but also generated anxieties about foreign influence and cultural authenticity. Technology spread that empowered societies, but also upset existing social arrangements. The Silk Road also demonstrates that global connection is not a modern invention. Millennia before jet aircraft and the internet, people were creating networks that spanned continents, exchanging goods and ideas across vast distances, influencing each other in profound ways. The forms of connection have changed, the technologies have advanced, but the human drive to connect, to trade, to learn from others. Modern globalization differs from the Silk Road in scale, speed, and pervasiveness. Today's global economy is far more integrated, with standardized containers moving goods efficiently across oceans, instant communication, enabling coordination across time zones, and financial systems linking markets worldwide. But the basic pattern, goods and ideas flowing between civilizations, bringing benefits and challenges, echoes the Silk Road experience. As we contemplate the Silk Road's legacy, we might consider what made it significant. It was not just the goods exchanged, though silk, spices, and precious items were important. It was not just the wealth accumulated, though many merchants prospered. It was rather the demonstration that different civilizations could interact productively, that distance could be overcome, that exchange created value beyond any single transaction. The Silk Road showed that humans are not naturally isolated, but rather naturally social creatures who benefit from interaction with others. It showed that cultural differences, while real, need not prevent cooperation and exchange. It showed that the human world, even in pre-modern times, was interconnected, with changes in one region rippling across vast distances to affect distant societies. The merchants, travelers, and migrants who used the Silk Road were not consciously trying to create a legacy or shape world history. They were pursuing their own interests, profit, spiritual enlightenment, adventure, survival. But their collective activity created something larger than any individual intended, a network that connected civilizations, transmitted ideas and technologies, and shaped the course of human development. This is perhaps the most profound lesson of the Silk Road, that individual actions, undertaken for personal reasons, can have collective consequences far beyond what anyone imagines. The Chinese weaver producing silk, the Sogdian merchant carrying it westward, the Persian broker selling it, the Byzantine aristocrat wearing it. None of them saw the full picture, but together they created a system that spanned Eurasia and influenced billions of lives. As our journey along the Silk Road concludes, we return to where we began, to the recognition that human history is not just the story of individual societies developing in isolation, but rather a story of interaction, exchange, and mutual influence. The Silk Road is one particularly vivid example of this broader pattern. But the pattern itself is universal and timeless. We live today in a world even more connected than the Silk Road world, where goods circle the globe in days rather than years, where ideas spread instantly via the internet, where diseases can trigger global pandemics in weeks. Understanding the Silk Road's history helps us understand our own time, helps us see both the benefits and the challenges of global connection. The Silk Road era showed that cosmopolitanism, the mixing of cultures, the acceptance of diversity, the willingness to learn from others, can coexist with maintaining distinctive cultural identities. Silk Road cities were simultaneously cosmopolitan and rooted in particular traditions. Merchants could operate across cultural boundaries while remaining Chinese, Persian, or Sogdian. This balance between openness and identity remains a challenge today. The Silk Road also showed the importance of infrastructure, not just physical infrastructure, like roads and caravanserais, but also institutional infrastructure, like commercial law, credit systems, and dispute resolution mechanisms. Trade requires more than buyers and sellers. It requires a framework of trust and predictability. Creating and maintaining this framework demands effort, investment, and cooperation across boundaries. Finally, the Silk Road reminds us that history is made not just by kings and generals, but by ordinary people pursuing ordinary goals. The merchants carrying goods, the porters loading camels, the innkeepers providing shelter, the translators facilitating communication, the farmers producing food, all were essential to the Silk Road's operation. History is not just great events and famous people, but also the accumulated actions of countless individuals whose names are forgotten, but whose contributions shaped the world. As you rest and reflect on this journey across mountains and deserts, through cities and civilizations, along routes that connected the world long before our modern age of globalization, perhaps you can appreciate the ingenuity, courage, and perseverance of those who traveled these paths. They faced hardships we can barely imagine, extreme climates, dangerous passages, uncertain reception in foreign lands, the constant risk of loss and death. Yet they persevered, driven by profit and curiosity, by spiritual seeking and political ambition, by the simple desire to see what lay beyond the horizon. In doing so, they created connections that enriched civilizations, transmitted knowledge that advanced human understanding, and demonstrated that despite our differences, humans across the world share common aspirations and can work together for mutual benefit. The Silk Road is gone as a living network of trade routes, but its legacy persists in the cultural DNA of societies it connected, in the technologies it transmitted, in the religious traditions it spread, and in the very idea that different peoples can come together in peace and mutual enrichment. May you carry this understanding forward, recognizing that we are all travelers on the Silk Road of history, connected to past and future, to distant places and different peoples, in ways both visible and invisible. Rest well with the knowledge that the journey continues, that the human story of connection and exchange unfolds still, and that each of us plays our part in shaping a world that is forever interconnected.